Hello everyone, my name is Zach and welcome to my channel. I am here with Matt.
Hi guys.
Who you may recognise from a little channel that's just recently hit, was it 500,000 subscribers?
Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
I've come over to Matt's because I've got some questions.
Okay.
And I've been researching 11th century arms and armour.
Battle of Hastings.
Battle of Hastings. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a pretty good grasp, I think, of the armour of the 11th century. But I wanted to come to you to ask what exactly is going on with the swords in the 11th century. Because, you know, you look online, most of the stuff that comes up are shops trying to sell you, you know, William the Conqueror's sword and things like that. It's hard to know what's right and what's wrong.
So it's an interesting period, the 11th century. So to put it into context, so we're coming out of what would commonly be described as the Viking era, I guess. Yeah. And when most people think of the Viking era, they think of swords that look like that, don't they? Yeah. With quite projecting pommels, with quite short crossguards. The blades, we'll talk about the blades in a minute, but this would be an oak shot type 10. But if we just focus on the hilt for a second, so fundamentally a short guard, and very often the guard doesn't really project any further than the pommel, although the pommel projects quite far in this period. Now, when we get into the 10th century, there is a tendency to get slightly longer guards. This isn't universal. There are also still short guards around, but there is a tendency for, in some places in the 10th century, so the 900s, for guards to get a little bit longer and for pommels to start to diversify in forms. And if you look at the outline of that kind of pommel there, so this is an English style, probably Anglo-Saxon style sword, that type of pommel starts to turn into what's sometimes described as a tea cozy shape. Okay. So if you imagine a teapot with a tea cozy on the top of it, and this actually, if you look at the overall outline of it, is not far away from being what we call a Brazil nut pommel. And we find later swords with Brazil nut pommels, and actually the outline of this pommel shape ergonomically is actually quite similar.
Yeah.
Okay. And it tilts away from the hand. Now that's a really interesting thing, because with earlier Viking era swords, they tend to be straighter across the bottom here. And if we go all the way back into the migration era, then a lot of the Viking era swords, but a lot of the earlier migration era swords are literally just a straight bar across there. Yeah. Now, it's not to say the straight bar type have disappeared yet. They haven't. It's just that we're starting to get pommels which curve away from the hand, and guards which sometimes curve away from the hand, like that Anglo-Saxon design, but also are starting to get longer. So we end up around about 1000 AD with swords that start to have much longer crossguards on them, and a few new types of pommel. This is a little bit later, this kind of more classic Brazil nut pommel. They are around in the 11th century, but what we tend to get is one that's a little bit more, what I describe it as a blob. Okay. So it's not a wheel pommel yet. I think a lot of people think it's a wheel. If we look at the Bayeux Tapestry, for example, you wouldn't really call that a wheel pommel, and it's not as Brazil nut-like as this yet. It's a little bit more nondescript and blob-shaped. But the really, really big development is this length of crossguard. And the question is, why? Why these long crossguards?
Yeah. So the handles on all of those, I'm looking, are all very short as well.
Yeah, although there is a general tendency for them to get a bit longer. So this one here is actually precisely modelled on one in the Museum of Ireland in Dublin. Yeah. And this is a sort of 800s, so 9th century style hilt. And very often Viking era hilts are under about 9.5 centimeters. So just the handle. So we're just talking about between the guard and the pommel. They're usually under, not always, some are bigger, but most of them are under 9.5 centimeters. And they can be as small as like 7.5 centimeters. Really, really cramped and small. Yeah. But that's partly because of the way you hold them.
Okay.
There is a general tendency as we get into the 11th century and the new types of pommel and crossguard for the grip to get a little bit longer. but not much. It is still quite short.
So the change in the Brazil nut, I was wondering if that's because the handle is smaller, and so that
no, the handles, if anything, get slightly longer.
So that's blown my idea out of the water. So what's going on then? What's driving this change?
So look, if we pick up a standard textbook on this subject, most people would marry this development of this type of sword with a longer guard, with a pommel which it's easier to, or so, as some people would say, it's easier to extend out like this.
Okay.
They would link it in with cavalry and horses.
Okay.
However, I completely refute that.
Yeah.
For several reasons, but here's just two reasons I'll give you straight off the bat. One is these long crossguards actually start to appear in Scandinavia quite early on.
Yeah.
And they weren't famous for using cavalry.
Yeah.
Firstly. Secondly, if we go to France or Francia, they'd been using cavalry for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
You know, Charlemagne had huge amounts of cavalry. It wasn't like cavalry was a new invention.
No.
And they'd been using Frankish style swords like that.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make sense to me.
No, that completely doesn't figure with me that cavalry requires longer crossguard or more shaped pommel.
So where I've landed up with this, and I've covered this in a few videos on my channel, is I think it's actually it's probably connected to lots of things, but I think it's partially connected to shields.
Okay.
And one thing that definitely does happen at this time is the move from the center grit boss grip shield.
Yeah.
Pardon my cold. To the strapped shields as seen on the Bear Tapestry.
Yeah.
Now, why do I say that? I'm certainly not the first person, or certainly won't be the last person to say that. If you have a strapped shield and you're striking with a sword, your hand is more likely to go beyond the range of the shield, what your shield is protecting. So your hand is more exposed and more vulnerable. With a boss grip shield, which are fantastic on foot, they're not so good on horseback, of course, because you can't move the hand around much because you're holding reins in the left hand. It projects far further out, so when you strike with a sword, your hand is behind the shield.
Yeah.
So I personally think that as people start to switch from boss grip shields to strap shields, that is when a crossguard starts to become more practical. And there's a possible ancient world parallel to this if we look at the Greeks.
Yeah.
So in most of the ancient world, there are no handguards on swords. A sword is just for stabbing and hitting. You don't really think that much about protecting the hand. But in most of the ancient world, most people have boss grip shields.
Yeah.
The Greeks, however, have essentially a strapped shield because they've got one bit around the forearm here and they're holding that hand at the front edge of the shield, which means when they strike with their Zephos, the hand's more likely to project beyond the edge of the shield, and lo and behold, they have swords with crossguards on them.
Okay.
So that's I don't know if I'm correct, but that's what I
certainly
think.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So on the Bayeux Tapestry, we see most of the people there do have the kite shields, whether they're Saxon or Norman. But we do see some Saxons with Frankish style
conical boss grip shields.
So,
and there's an interesting thing as well. You know, we don't have all of the Bear Tapestry.
Yeah.
And towards the end of the tapestry, there's a scene when the Saxons start to basically rout and get mopped up by the Norman forces.
Yeah.
And as we get to the end of it, we see more and more of these. I think because they're trying to show a mass of Saxons.
Yeah.
So categorically, and you never ever see these in the hands of Normans.
No.
The Normans always have the kite shield.
Yeah.
And of course, bear in mind that Edward the Confessor was, to all intents and purposes, a Norman.
Yeah.
So there had already been an injection of Norman culture into England by this point. So clearly kite shields have become popular. And we know that kite shields were used in Scandinavia as well.
Yeah.
So kite shields had started to come in, but clearly a lot of Saxons still were using their old boss grip shields as well, I think. And archaeologically, we've got remains of the bosses surviving.
Yeah. So does this suggest that while the Norman knights would most likely be wielding a sword similar to this, we might see swords like those being used by the Saxons?
Yeah, so the problem with using Bear Tapestry as a source, and it is a fantastic source, and we don't have many sources from the 11th century, so we have to use Bear Tapestry. Some people are really critical of it, but it's like, well,
what else do we use?
Exactly, we've only got like 20 sources, so clearly we're going to use Bear Tapestry. But one of the problems with it is the artists making it, probably English women, as far as we know, they clearly decide what an armor, what a helmet, what a sword, what an axe, what a horse is going to look like. And a bit like Lego elements, and then they just reproduce that over and over and over again. So pretty much all of the swords in the tapestry look the same. Okay. They've got a more or less long crossguard, and they've got a blob type pommel. And they're all one-handed arming swords, as all swords are at this time. However, I feel pretty certain saying that a lot of the English who would have fought at Stamford Bridge or Hastings absolutely would have been using traditional Anglo-Saxon swords that they happen to have. It might have been their grandfather's sword or their father's sword. It could have been their great-great-great-great-grandfather's sword. We don't know, I mean, we've got things like the Coppergate helmet, which is clearly from the 700s, but it's buried probably in the 800s, so that some of these things would have stayed around in use. And swords weren't that prevalent in 11th century England. So if a sword was still usable, you'd use it. So absolutely, I think there would have been 9th, 10th century swords still in use. And probably in a place like England, which was, I wouldn't quite call it a backwater. It was one of the principal kingdoms of Europe, but
we've always been quite conservative.
Yeah, and also it was, until the Norman conquest, it was looking to Scandinavia, Harold Godwinson's mother was Danish, and you'd had Canute and his family ruling over England. So you still got housecarls with big two-handed Danish axes. So we were more like a Scandinavian kingdom at that point. And in Scandinavia, going all the way through the 11th century, we've still got these sorts of Viking era looking swords still being used. So.
Okay, cool. Well, so for me, I'm looking at something Norman. So it's likely I'm going to need to be looking for something like this then. With
a Brazil nut, because we know the Brazil nuts were in use in the 11th century. In my opinion, they tend to be a bit more late 11th century. Okay. At Hastings, I think you're more likely to see more of a blob type pommel. Okay. To be honest, they're quite boring looking swords, actually. They're kind of the first arming sword, as we'd call it from a later medieval point of view. It's a generic straight crossguard and a blob for a pommel.
And from this one, different to the Viking style one.
You'll prefer how that one handles, incidentally. The one that you've got is quite a beast. This one is much more nimble.
Okay, so we have differences in the blade weight. So just for the viewer who obviously hasn't just felt what I've just felt, a lot of the weight in this sword is down at the tip to make it. This particular one is a beast, and this one's actually made by Paul Binns. That one's actually a windlass. But it just so happens that Paul Binns had made this really big blade, and I asked him to mount it up on a Norman era hilt. But this would be good from horseback for just a massive, great cleaving blows. But I absolutely wouldn't want to use this on foot with a shield one-on-one in a duel type situation. I'd definitely choose the lighter, quicker one. So this one, the tip of the blade is a lot faster and a lot more manoeuvrable.
And there's another thing which also I said about blades. So in the migration era, so after the Romans bugger off, basically, in most of Germanic Europe, we've got what we would call the Type 10 oakshot Type 10 blade, which is almost parallel edged, very broad, quite spatulate tipped. Okay, this in the 10th, maybe late 9th, 10th century. We start to get blades. This isn't a great example, but you see it's starting to get a bit of taper on it. And in fact, there are more tapered examples than this. So already in the late Viking era, well before the Normans turn up, you've got blades which have a taper down the blade, which obviously changes the weight mass distribution of them. And by the 11th century, most swords are tapered. They are broader here than there, and they're even thinner down here. So they're starting to get more pointy, which might be an adaptation to the fact that more people have got mail, because we know definitely in the 11th century, as we can see in the Bear Tapestry, most soldiers have hauberks of mail, whereas if you go back to King Alfred the Great's time, probably most didn't have mail. So there was a lot more armour around, so the point starts to become more and more important. And having a longer blade, particularly if you're on horseback, seems to have become more important. So generally, the average length of the blades in the 11th century becomes greater. And if you have a longer blade, to keep it wieldable, you want to make it tapered so that it won't be too unwieldy. Because if you this is the example.
Have that blade geometry on that, using it one-handed would be
so the reason this is such a beast to handle is because it is a long blade, but it is also very broad at the tip. Whereas this one is much more tapered and therefore much more wieldable as a result. So this is a bit later still. This is more sort of late 12th, 13th century, but it's the same principle as the Norman era swords.
Okay, very cool. So thank you very much, Matt.
My pleasure.
For that quick rundown. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. You've got one as well, don't you, Matt? So,
I do, yeah. I love my patrons. They're very important.
Check the links in the description, guys, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.